Good afternoon, grade 3/4s, and welcome to our music class for Friday, January 7th. You will notice in the packet that was sent home with you, the worksheet for today was the musical instrument crossword. And there's a number of instruments that are framing the crossword. And what you're to do with this sheet is actually to find the name of each instrument, and there is a little bit of a hint down here, and to put the name in the proper spot. Now, when it says, for instance, at the top, it says to across, you would go to across right there, and you would write what that instrument is. The music history of each of these instruments are quite long. There's not a single instrument here that has just been a recent, probably the most recently created of any of them, and it would be a long time, well over 100 years ago, would be this instrument. Now, I'm not going to tell you the names of all of the instruments, but the very oldest vocal instrument is not actually on this page. Does anybody want to wager a guess of what that might be? The oldest instrument. Well, of course, it would be vocals. They're considered the oldest instrument, and long before even a lot of languages were fully developed, the vocal language and the vocal instrument was used. The oldest known instrument to man, other than the vocal cords, and it is thousands of years ago, was what was called a flute, and it's actually called the Neanderthal flute. And how it was built or made was actually they would take the bones of animals and they would clean out the center of them. So they would kind of clean it all out. There might be a natural hole, but they would extend the size of that hole. So they had a tube, and then they would drill, not with a drill as we know it, but with some other kind of tool, ancient tool, holes in it. And then when they would blow through that Neanderthal flute, it would create a sound. Now, do you know which family that Neanderthal flute would have been part of? I believe that they were created, I said a couple thousand years ago. I would like to know the exact year, but I believe they were created for all families and all ages to use, and they were inexpensive. So the three families of origins of instruments was the wind family, the string family, and the percussion family. Now, sometimes they can be further divided between those, but that's basically the first three families of origin of instruments. So, if those were the three families, which one do you think the Neanderthal flute, the first recorded instrument, would be in? Well, because it took wind to create the sound by blowing, it would be part of the wind instrument family. So the vocal cords also, although there is a vibration that happens, which is what the string instruments create sound by, but it also takes air moving through to create vocals. So what I want you to do after you have finished doing this worksheet is to then color the lines or frame them with these three colors. Listen carefully. So we're going to use green for any instrument of these that are wind. So use pencil first of all, but then outline in green if you believe it to be a wind instrument. If you believe it to be a percussion instruments are instruments that respond to some sort of force against them, okay? Not wind, which is blowing, a more direct hit force, okay? We don't always like to use the word hit because some of the instruments need to be gently have a force against them. All right, so you use the blue for whichever of these, after you filled them in, square them around with blue for percussion instruments. And then finally, I would like you to grab your yellow marker, and after you've created the wind instruments or figured out which of these are wind instruments in your crossword, use yellow for the wind instrument. And then we can go over that and talk about that together. Remembering that wind create air, Percussion requires some sort of force against them. And string is the vibration of a string to create it. Now, you might be surprised. Some of these you might be surprised which families they go into. So when we create an orchestra as a symphony, which I know in our class the other day, we were doing some conducting patterns with the conductor's wand, or the baton, as sometimes it's referred to as well. It takes a great number of those instruments, each using from the different families their sounds. And when we combine all those, many instruments, it creates a very full sound. And that's why there are these three different families. And so the instruments evolved. They didn't all start out like we have a flute today, which is very different than the flute I just talked about, the Neanderthal flute. I don't think anybody has those in their homes anymore. But I'm sure you'd see them in museums and that if you were to visit the history of music. And even the piano that we know as today is a very evolved instrument to the one that we play today. So many of the instruments, and then we move on into electronic instruments. I wanted to briefly tell you a little bit about when you would hear somebody say, you say, I play the guitar. And they say, do you play an acoustic guitar? Acoustic simply refers to the idea that there aren't electronics, or you don't have to plug it in or have a battery to create the sound. So an acoustic guitar would be one that is not plugged in, as opposed to an electric guitar. Sometimes on a piano, you would say, I would ask, do you have an acoustic piano at home? And some people are confused by that. If you have an acoustic instrument, it does not plug in. So you have a piano at home that doesn't need to be plugged into the wall, as opposed to some that need to be plugged in or use batteries. And so there's many instruments that are acoustic or electronic. Now, in addition to that, sometimes we will have acoustic instrument with what we call pickups. And the pickups are a microphone, so to speak, that is in the instrument and electronically picks up the sound. But that does not change the instrument. It still can be considered an acoustic instrument. For instance, at my church, I play the piano. It's an acoustic piano, but it does have a microphone in it that has been added to pick up the sound, but it doesn't change it. So it's important to know those questions about instruments too. Obviously, early instruments were all acoustic because there weren't electronics. But then again, through the evolution of these different instruments change and grow. And so we sometimes call it evolving and changing. And that happens with the instruments we have. But the oldest instrument is one that you all play very well and use, and that's your singing. So even though we're not together and maybe starting to learn our instruments, I think that we should just work on our vocal instruments, which you did such a great job for in the Christmas musical. So next week when we get together, we'll go on with this and we'll talk about that. So fill it out and then divide it into the different musical families. Wind, you're going to use green. Percussion, you're going to use blue. String, you're going to use yellow. You can even maybe circle some of these around to help you. All right, we'll see you next week. Have a great week. Bye-bye.